You ever hit that point where, your job is fine, the family's good, but you catch yourself wondering, is this it? You're doing what you're supposed to do, you're paying the bills, keeping things steady, but something inside of you still feels like it's just missing. Today's guest, Billy Rudd, knows that feeling. After years of climbing the corporate ladder, traveling nonstop, and barely catching his kids' games, he decided to walk away from it all. What started as a side hustle, roasting coffee, turned into Cloud Splitter Coffee, a small business built on authenticity, hard work, and the kind of grind that actually feels good. Billy's story is about finding the joy in the work again and setting an example for your kids along the way. It's kind of a cool story, and hopefully you get something good out of it, especially if you're considering starting a business yourself. But before we get into the story, I want to take a moment to raise awareness for something that's important to our community, the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation. This organization is working to build a permanent national memorial in Washington, D.C. to honor the service members, families, and civilians who were impacted by the global war on terrorism. This memorial will serve as both a tribute to those who served and as a way to ensure that their sacrifices are recognized and remembered for generations to come. If you'd like to learn more or find out how you can support their mission, visit gwapmemorialfoundation.org. Now let's get into today's episode. Hey, Billy, welcome to the show. I'm really glad to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we kind of jump into the conversation, get into, kind of what we're going to be talking about here today, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your background, your military background, and things like that, just for the listeners who aren't familiar with you and who you are.
Yeah, so my name is Billy Rudd. I am the owner and founder of Cloud Splitter Coffee. More importantly, though, I'm a dad of two awesome kids. One's going into two boys. One's going into high school this year. He's the JV quarterback, and the other just started middle school. So both in new schools and well-adjusted. They're great kids, intelligent, kind, athletic. Really, really blessed in that capacity. Let's see. I grew up in upstate New York. To military listeners out there, very close to Fort Drum, 10th Mountain Division. So I grew up on a dairy farm up there. And then after high school, like a lot of farm kids, I joined the Air Force. And I served in the Air Force from 95 to 99, kind of between the Gulf Wars. And I was a crew member on a plane called Araya in the Air Force. I bet I'm the only Araya person to ever be on this podcast because it was the smallest career field in the Air Force, and that job doesn't exist anymore. It's been taken over by satellites. But a really cool plane, cool job. I was stationed out at Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California, Flight Test Center, where the sonic or where the sound barrier was broke, and just a really cool place to be stationed if you're an aviation enthusiast. So I did that for 4 years, and then got out and went to college and professional career, and here I am today talking to you.
Awesome. So you got into the Air Force. Any kind of lessons or things that you kind of took away from your time in the Air Force? I know a lot of people, when they get into the military, it kind of changes who they are. The military breaks you down and builds you back up to what they want you to be, right? And then you get out and you look back and there's all these lessons that you've learned or that you've accumulated. You may not have even realized it during that time that you were in the military, but then you come away and you're like, oh, I'm doing things differently. I'm starting to notice how I'm different from some of the civilians that maybe I'm working with or going to school with or things like that. And you start to realize just how much of an impact that's had on your life. Any kind of big takeaways from your career in the Air Force and kind of anything that maybe helped with your post-military career?
Yeah, so a couple things that I think affected me personally, and then some things professionally as well. One, like I said, I grew up on a farm, so I was already pretty fit. I was just kind of a hazard of the occupation. But after I got out of the military, I was no longer a farm kid, and but I kept fitness as a priority. And here I am, 48 years old, and it's still a priority. I exercise every day, and I think a lot of that comes from my military background. The other thing I would say also is just being, personally and professionally organized, whether it's time management or just having systems in place that just keep just keep me organized,
Hmm.
So of course I got a lot of that from the Air Force as well. And I think from a professional standpoint, so after I left the Air Force, I went on to work for Red Lobster and Darden restaurants for 23 years. I started there as a server with no restaurant experience. I left as a senior director of operations, leading a division of 55 restaurants. So it's kind of I don't know, the restaurant business is kind of one of the last meritocracies where you really can kind of put your nose to the grindstone. It doesn't matter kind of what you know, it's kind of what you put into it.
Sure.
And one of the things that became important to me is, especially when I got into a position of hiring, really over the last like 10 to 12 years, um, is not so much as necessarily somebody's intelligence, but their emotional intelligence. And, I kind of equate that to, if you have a bad day at work, are you going to go home and get on LinkedIn and go get a new job? Or are you going to, kind of buckle down and it's hard to suss that out when you're hiring for something or promoting somebody. If you're promoting somebody internally, you know everything about them. But if you're interviewing somebody for 45 minutes, it's hard to figure out if that person has grit, if they have emotional intelligence, and there really isn't questions that are good for it. So as I kind of started to think about it, one of the things that I realized, and I kind of leaned back in my military training, is military folks, veterans, that are now in the private sector. Most of them do have emotional intelligence, because even if you've only went to basic training and you weren't deployed to a combat zone like me, if you've been yelled at for 2 months straight, that's better than any corporate job, right? Because nobody's yelling at you or you're going to HR. So I learned that a lot of folks who have a military background are great candidates for jobs, especially high stress jobs, because they face these conditions way worse than this any day. So
Right.
yeah, a couple things I learned.
Yeah, and one of the things you just mentioned was how military folks are great in those high stress environments. And I found through conversations that I've had with people that it almost becomes addicting to be in those kind of high stress environments where you're looking for chaos. Where some people are looking for, hey, I just want to go in, punch the clock, and work my 9 to 5, and collect my paycheck and move on. Sometimes people are so used to the chaotic, high stress environments that it's like I kind of can't do anything other than that. Like I kind of need to have some sort of high stress situation going on, and that could be a good and a bad thing. Obviously, there's some jobs that's an occupational hazard. Law enforcement, paramedics, firefighters, those types of things. Any of those are gonna be high stress at times, and you have to be able to deal with those. And if you just crumble under the pressure, you're not going to be able to do very well in those types of jobs. But not every job is like that. If you're working, 9 to 5 in a cubicle and you're,
I couldn't
punching
do
out
it.
spreadsheets, yeah, I mean, a lot of people
Glad
just
people
wouldn't be able to
can.
do it, right?
Yeah.
But if that's what you're doing, and you're craving that high stress environment, that high octane kind of situation, you're probably not going to be able to manage that very well. I know when I got back from Afghanistan, I went back to work, and I was going into basically a cubicle situation in an office environment. I didn't last very long there. It just wasn't for me anymore. I had a real tough time doing that. So, but being able to kind of reflect and look in on yourself and kind of understand what it is that you're looking for and what you might need, and how you might be able to satisfy those needs going forward, I think is important too, in addition to all those things that you just said, right?
Yeah.
Now, so you worked in kind of these larger corporations for a while. You
Mhm.
mentioned Red Lobster was one of them, and you've kind of bounced around a little bit. Then eventually you kind of moved on, and you're now with Cloud Splitter
Mhm.
Coffee, right? And
That's correct.
tell us about that. What was that decision like, and how did you get into to doing that?
Yeah, so professionally, like I said, I was with Red Lobster for 23 years, and then I left them and worked at Top Golf. I was the national director of ops there, running a bunch of venues for them. And probably about 6 months before I left Red Lobster, I founded Cloud Splitter just as an e-commerce company, shipping coffee all over the country, to a lot of the listeners to this podcast, there's probably some familiarity with Black Rifle Coffee,
Hmm.
a coffee brand that targets the military and veteran community and first responders as well. They're a great company. I would say Cloud Splitter is very similar to that model of a company, but we target the outdoor industry. So hikers, mountain climbers, runners, so on and so forth. So I had this going on for about 3 years, just kind of as a side project, and it was growing and growing. And an opportunity kind of came along for me to leave Top Golf. Like I said, my kids are getting older, and I know that these are going to be the best years of my life. Being able to, one, they're just fun to hang out with, but go to their events, or go to their games, and all that kind of stuff. And with the job that I was in, I was flying to work every week. I was 100 nights a year at the Marriott. My office was in Dallas. I live in Maryland. It was really, I had a lot of competing priorities, and I couldn't find a way to be in two places at once.
Right.
Luckily, I had Cloud Splitter kind of as a little side project I had going on, and we were gaining some traction, particularly with the running community. We've become a bit of a running brand, so like marathoners and folks like that, they've really become attracted to our swag, to our merchandise, and was able to leave Top Golf and do Cloud Splitter full time. We also have a mobile coffee shop, you could say, is essentially kind of think of like a Starbucks on wheels, but we call it the Brew Box, and we take it to all kinds of events. I mean, we're booked out for months.
Oh, that's great.
We've become really popular pretty quick. So, and it's great coffee. So where the name comes from is the Cloud Splitter is a really tall mountain, and I've climbed hundreds of mountains, and it was my Instagram handle for a long time, and everybody was like, dude, I like your name. I like your name. And one time we were on a trip, and my girlfriend and I, and it had been raining for like days on end, and it was just just really kind of a miserable trip to the mountains. And I just said it out loud. It's like Cloud Splitter coffee. I don't know why, but she's like, I'd buy that. And so we got back from that trip, and I bought the domain name cloudsplittercoffee.com and started the LLC, and then quickly realized I was in over my head because I knew nothing about coffee, and it took about 6 months to kind of form the company in the background, and launched it, like I said, about 6 months later, and it's been a wild ride.
That's kind of a nice way to start a business is when you have a job, so you have some financial security, something that you can fall back on if you're starting a business. And let's say you start it and it doesn't work out. The customers aren't there. You thought it was a great idea, whatever it is, whether it's coffee or something else, maybe it's some service or product that you might have in mind, and you start this business and it doesn't work out. Well, you always have that job that you can kind of fall back on, right? And so like in your situation, you started this, you still had your job at Top Golf going on, and it was kind of something that you're handling on the side. It wasn't like you just quit and just dove in head first into basically nothing, starting off from scratch, right? So you at least had some way of kind of starting off.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I've noticed in business that I've been a part of is the thing that you pay more attention to will start to generate more income, so and that may not make a ton of sense the way I just phrased it, but just as an example, I had a business where I was building websites for people, and that was fine. And I was doing like maintenance on the websites and all that kind of stuff. That part was good. But it wasn't really where my passion was. I was doing it. It was paying the bills. It was good. I also had developed some software that would run on websites that it was kind of more of an afterthought. It was like I built it because I needed it, or maybe one of my clients needed it. And I was like, I'll just put it out there on the website and see if it sells. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, whatever. It's not a big deal because I needed to build it anyways. And then I was like, that's really where my passion was. And I really wanted to do more of that. And so I kind of said, you know what, I'm not going to take on any more website design clients. I'm going to go focus on the software side of things and just do that. And it was like, within a very short amount of time, that took over my business, and all of my time got dedicated to, supporting those software products. And it was really because I spent more time on it, started marketing it more, and really kind of giving it the attention that it deserved, and it just kind of blew up from there. And so I imagine, when you were working at Topgolf, probably wasn't growing as quickly as it would be if you were spending it full time, dedicated to it. And I imagine after you kind of switched to doing this full time, that's where you probably saw some pretty significant growth, right?
Yeah, 100%. So now you're taking, 50 hours a week that I was working at Topgolf, and he shifted it to this other thing that now you got to make it work, you
Right,
know?
right, right.
And so, yeah, 100%. That's when I've seen the most growth.
Yeah,
Hands down, it's not even a question. But to your point, when you really shift to the thing that you really want to do, then you're also happier, and that's what matters, right?
sure.
When you think about just your work life balance, and you've got to do something to make money, so you ought to do something that makes you happy, and follow where your passions are, and it's just a lot more enjoyable spending your time on something like that. So
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was very helpful, like in my case that I just described, because it wasn't like I was dreading going to do the work that I was doing. I was actually looking forward to it, and I would spend more time on it than I might have otherwise if it was a job that I really wasn't too thrilled about, but it was paying the bills, but I wasn't too thrilled about it. I probably wouldn't put as much effort into it, but it was something that it was paying the bills, but also it was something I liked. So of course I'm
mhm,
going to spend more time doing it,
yeah.
and that I think really helped in the growth of what I was doing. But so I guess ultimately kind of that takeaway for any of the listeners is try to find something that you're passionate about that you can make money with, and will allow you to kind of feel like you're not even having to go to work.
Yeah.
It's more fun than work.
Oh, yeah, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that's important is, when you're going to start a business, though, is know who your audience is.
Mm,
Like who's your target customer essentially, and I think it's important to be authentic. At least, for Cloud Splitter, it's been really important to be authentic, especially with
yeah.
small brands now. People want to know who's the face behind the brand, right?
Sure.
And if you're creating some sort of mountain brand, but you've never been to the mountains, like you're going to get called out real quick. But, it really did start out with a lot of people who just kind of knew me. They've seen me on the mountains. They've seen me on the Appalachian Trail. They've seen me at the ultra marathons. They know I've sleep in my Forerunner, and you can't fake that type of authenticity. And it just becomes, like I said, it becomes fun because your customers, especially at first, are probably going to be your friends. They're going to be people
Yeah.
and then it's going to be people that they know that are very similar to them, and then you're creating a community. I think a lot of brands think about having an audience, but I think about it as creating a community, of just kind of kindred spirits. And we say at Cloud Splitter that we're for the love of the grind. It's kind of a double entendre with
Sure.
grind. But whether you're running a 100-mile ultra marathon or you love coffee, we're always grinding.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just nice when those things kind of just come together, and it just happens to work out that you can use that same phrase and it has a couple different meanings there. That it just works out nice that way. But so for folks who are kind of in your world, right, like in the entrepreneurship world, whether it's coffee or it's something else, someone who has an idea, has a passion for something, they don't know really where to get started. What were kind of some of the first steps that, like, for you? I know you said you kind of had the idea, bought the domain. Those are easy things. You can spend $10 and buy a domain name. Anyone can do that. But then there's business that you got to get down to business, and
Yeah.
figure out how to do that. And sometimes an idea is just that, it's just an idea. Where do you go from there after the idea? How did you kind of test it out and make sure that is this actually a business, or is this just kind of a fun idea?
Yeah, so I think right away I knew exactly, Cloud Splitter Coffee. I had a name. I felt like it rolled off the tongue pretty well. I knew what I wanted to sell, the product that I wanted to sell, and I had a pretty clear, as far as, customers go. But then, like you said, when it comes down to brass tacks, like package design, logos, brand story, building a website, all that kind of stuff. I don't know anything about that kind of stuff. I know a little bit from my corporate career, but I'm not an expert really on much of that. I've been in operations my whole life. So I employed the experts. I went to an agency who works with small startup food brands, and we had a sit down session. Like here's what I'm envisioning. And they loved the name of the company. They loved everything that I just said. but like I think like a lot of people, I'd kind of started out with like a logo generator. I was like, oh, I even got an idea for a logo, and there was no Chat GPT at that time. But if there had been, they would have said that looked like it was made with Chat GPT. Like it looks like a logo generator made it, and it needs some refinement. So together in partnership, we went through many iterations of logos, and well, actually, the first thing you got to do is a brand story, and that's the first thing I would tell anybody is essentially a brand story is not your history. It's essentially your constitution. It's kind of your manifesto as a brand, and we have it printed on the back of every bag of coffee, and that is our brand's voice. That is kind of the direction that our brand goes is off of everything that's on that story. And then we did logo design and colors and packaging and all that kind of stuff. So I'd say if you're not, familiar with that, probably employing the export experts to do it
Yeah.
is probably some pretty good advice. Probably maybe it depends on what you're doing, but I wanted to look clean and professional all the way.
Yeah, and I think for anyone starting a business who's starting it by themselves, they don't have partners or, co-founders, that type of thing, finding other people who are good at the things that you're not good at and recognizing where you add value to the business. If your value is in, one area, you probably don't need to be spending your time doing the taxes and the bookkeeping and the, all those other things. Like you can hire that out and get somebody else who can do that, which then frees up your time to focus on the things that you are good at, the things that actually add value to your business and allow you to grow the business and do bigger and better things. But if you're spending all your time doing administrative work that really you don't need to be doing, you're not going to grow as fast or at all, because you're
Yeah.
going to be so tied up in fighting fires here and there and doing all these little things that you really don't need to be doing. You'd be better off finding somebody else who can do that stuff for you. So, I think, to your point, you weren't a branding guy and that wasn't your thing, but a huge part of what your business is about needs to have a good solid brand behind
Hmm.
it. And if you just use that logo generator and maybe even I'm not saying that this was exactly your case, but if you kind of half-ass your way through all of whatever it is that you're trying to do as far as the branding goes, people are going to see right through that. And to your point earlier, that community was really really focused on that story and that background that you had. And if you don't do a good job communicating that message, you're gonna start losing people, and you'll never build that community. So I think folks who are starting a business definitely figure out what it is that you are good at and do more of that, and figure out the things that you're not good at and do less of that and find somebody else to do those things, right?
Yeah, because I mean, you're probably going to need a website, right? And if you're not a web designer, you're going to get really frustrated building a mediocre website
Right.
probably, and that could be enough to squash that fire that you had burning in you to start this business in the first place.
Yeah.
So keep the stoke high. Yeah, employ the experts where needed. I think I am a branding guy, but I'm not a design guy, right? Like
Sure.
I've
Okay.
got
Yeah.
vision in my head. Like I'm probably more big picture, but I need somebody else to kind of take my vision and put it down for me. So
So transitioning from the corporate world to entrepreneurial world, you were saying your time was pretty stretched pretty thin when you were working in the corporate world, with traveling and all these other things that you other commitments that you had going on. How do you see the difference between that and your time now as an entrepreneur? Are you finding any benefits to that where you're having a little bit more flexibility in your schedule, a little bit more, I hate to use the term work-life balance, that's just one that is commonly used, but just able to enjoy life and do the things that you want to do outside of work, but also keeping time for work as well. Are you finding that it's any easier, or a little more flexible, or is it maybe even more difficult?
to all that. So I probably actually work more hours now, but it's all contained, right? I'm not all over the country.
Yeah.
It's all right here. So I'm home in my own bed every night. I'm able to pick my kids up from practice. I see them more. They go back and forth between me and their mom. So I have a bit of a limited schedule, but now I'm able to be more open with that. So that's great. And I don't miss any games, so in many ways, that's good. One of the responsibilities I had, kind of a side project I had at Topgolf, is I launched and chaired for 2 years their mental health employee resource group. So a lot of brands have employee resource groups for all different affinities. Topgolf aspired to be one of the top employers in the country as it relates to mental health, and we did a lot of great things there to kind of make that come to light. But there's two things that I aspired for with that employee resource group, and that was to, one, create a community, just like we talked about, because there's a lot like creating a brand, but also providing resources for, we have a lot of young people, in the hospitality business,
Mhm.
and providing resources. And with that, I had some social media chops, so they wanted me to kind of put that to good use. And I created a video one time about what you were just talking about, work-life balance. And I tend to think of it a little differently. I talk about work-life harmony, so
Yeah.
because it's not always in balance, right? There's sometimes where you have to focus more on work and, and a little less on your personal life. And there's other times where you get, more time in your personal life and you're not so focused on work. And so when I think about, kind of my current situation, yeah, I have the ability to say no to like certain events. If I want to keep that date open for me, or
Hmm.
for something I want to do in my personal life, or I can say yes, and or I can have two different clients that are trying to book an event the same day, and I have a choice, picking whichever one I want for whatever reason I want. So yeah, I would say I probably work more hours now, but I'm certainly happier now by far, just because I would say, more control over my schedule, just because I don't have to be at a meeting in Dallas,
Right.
on Tuesday. I don't have to be on 6 Teams calls a day, you know, and when you're the boss, in that position, they pay for your phone because they expect you to pick it up 24/7, and after, years and years of that, it can lead to a little bit of burnout. So yeah, I would say in many ways, I have better work-life balance today.
Yeah, and that's good. And I think to what you're just saying, I guess it really just depends on what it is that you're looking for. And if you want to be able to have that kind of flexibility to be able to go to your kids' sports events or to, other things that you have going on in your life, whatever that may be, there are certainly some benefits with being the boss and making your own schedule and kind of laying that all out yourself. If, hey, life's getting too busy right now, maybe I need to back away and not take that event on or that new client on or whatever. And you can do that because you're the boss.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're working for somebody else, well, you do the work that you're told to do. And if it's getting too busy for you, well, that's too damn bad. Like,
Yeah.
that's what you got to do. And so, I don't know. There's kind of a bit of a trade off, but you kind of have to just feel it out and see what feels right for you, I guess. And I guess that's something everyone has to do, right?
Yeah, I think one of the benefits for me specifically, again, is going back to just kind of my personal situation, but my kids are able to jump in and help now as well, which is good for them. It's like a first job for
Yeah.
them. They are making like tips through our mobile, coffee shop, and but they're learning about, getting up early and going to work and getting organized and all the different equipment and hospitality and and working for tips and things like that.
Yeah.
And I was tucking in my youngest son the other day, and we had done an event, and I was like, "What?" I always ask him, "What was the best part of your day?" And he was talking about how he had the confidence to talk to a couple hundred strangers that day. I think we had made over 400 drinks. I mean, he took every single order, and he's 11 years old. He's running this cash register, and it takes a lot of guts, to talk to, and so that's been a great benefit as well.
Well, yeah, and so there's a lot of stuff that a kid that age can take away from that. I mean, obviously, making some money that's pretty cool, and a
Yeah.
lot of kids his age probably don't have any money to their name, and but he's able to go out there and earn some money, and that kind of instills a bit of a work ethic, and that I think is a good thing. And but that social interaction, being able talk to complete strangers, to adults who maybe aren't related or friends of the family or anything like that. They're just random strangers who coming up to order a coffee. Having that confidence to be able to talk to those people and take their order, get their order right, make the order, collect payment, maybe if they're paying cash, give the right change, that type of thing. There's a lot of lessons. There's, basic math that comes into there, but
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff is stuff that you don't get sitting there playing Xbox,
Yeah.
that type of thing that a lot of folks do. You're not learning those lessons, and those things are going to help your kids out, whether they start a business themselves or whatever job that they end up in, it's going to help them out because it's just going to give them a better work ethic. I think, I tried doing that with my kids as well, having them, help out in the business in one way or another. It could even just be small things, and all those things are, ways that they can, learn a little bit about hard work and earn some money and feel kind of proud about the work that they did, and look back and like, hey, you know what, I accomplished something, and that's pretty good. And like I said, you don't get that from Xbox.
Yeah, at first I was a little bit conflicted on what I thought about that, but then I remembered I grew up on a dairy farm. Like, my parents started taking me to the barn when I was 5 days old, so I always joked I had the first 4 days of my life off. You know, so I don't feel so bad about it now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And it's good. I think getting involved in the family business, helping out where you can, but also being fair. Obviously, they're making some money. They're learning some skills, and those are things that and I keep harping on the video games, but even just going to school, you don't learn those things going to school either. Those things are not to knock the teachers or anything like that. That's not what I'm trying to do. It's just that's not the focus of school. And
interaction it just isn't the way it's not the same as it was when we were kids, right?
sure,
Yeah, it's it's obviously much more digital these days, but
yeah,
there's some business that it doesn't matter what you want to do in life, you're going to have to sell something. You're going to have
hmm
to sell a product, or you're going to have to sell a service. That's how you're going to make money. And you got a lot better chance of being successful if you've got some personality to go along with it. And so um, yeah, I think that's been a side benefit of the mobile operation. But then they get to come home and see all the digital orders that have come in too, and they got to fill these bags back here, print shipping labels and all that. So
right. And
yeah,
but again, all of those things are things that when you buy something online, whether it's Amazon or wherever it is that you buy from, you you just see the screen in front of you that you place the order, put your credit card in, place the order, and then it shows up on your doorstep. You don't know all the other things that happen in the background between the warehouse and all the picking the products and packaging it and shipping labels and all the things, the customer service aspect of it. If an order gets delivered, it's the wrong product, or something happens, like all of those other things that happen in the background. I mean, most people don't have any clue how that operates, for especially for a small business. I'm not talking a big company like Amazon, but small businesses, like a lot of times it it's the business owner who's taking care of that stuff, or immediate family members or something like that, like in your case. Customer service and everything, that's probably landing on your plate, or you might get to a point where you have somebody else who comes in and takes care of that stuff. But you're probably going to be pretty close to that, no matter how big the business gets. You want to know where are the problems, and how do we mitigate those problems so that they don't happen again, and that type of stuff. So you are continuously improving and making sure that the business is just getting better and better, and improving that customer experience, going forward. But
yeah, I mean, 100%. When I was with Top Golf or with Red Lobster, I mean, I had thousands of employees under my leadership, and hundreds of millions of dollars in my P&L that I was responsible for. But I read every single guest complaint,
yeah,
every single one of them, because that tells a story.
sure,
And if somebody's putting in a guest complaint, it's because they want you to win. People don't like really take the time to write. I mean, there's a few, but it's not really worth trying to weed those out. It's a very small percentage. But I think when people complain, it's because we let them down. They're cheering for you. They want you to win. They didn't want to this situation to happen, and you
yeah,
just, yeah. So I don't think it really matters how big or how small you are. I think if you are are listening to your customers, you're going to learn a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a veteran starting a business, were there any benefits to being a veteran in starting this business, as far as any services that were available to you, or even just the resilience and grit from being a veteran? Anything that you found that was helpful for you in getting this business off the ground?
Um, so I didn't really use any like specific services like financial aid or anything like that. But one thing I did learn is we did kind of in small font places on the website and on the packaging, on the back of the packaging, it says veteran owned. And it was interesting, like when we first started the brand, we'd go to like some festivals and we had like a branded tent and stuff like that. And we'd talk to people who are like, what's Cloud Splitter? And we'd talk to them and they were interested, but not super interested. But as soon as they heard veteran owned, that's when they became a lot more interested.
Yeah,
Now I live in like a rural area and we were doing festivals out in this area. And I don't know, I think that resonates a little bit more, at least here where I live, the veteran part. So I've learned that people certainly are more inclined to support veteran-owned businesses. So I would. We still don't scream it from the rooftops. I just personally that's just not who. I would be inauthentic if I was screaming
sure.
from the rooftops. But it is out there a little bit more than in the early part of the brand, and it's like it's something that they were in the service, their parents were, or they just like supporting veterans.
Yeah.
So I would say if I was giving advice to a veteran starting a business, that to put that out there in some way, shape, or form. So
Yeah, yeah. Kind of don't shy away from it. Lean into it a little bit. But to your
mhm.
point, you don't need to, have your brand colors being red, white, and blue, and make it all, make it be the whole. I mean, if it is, that's fine. But
If that's who you are authentically, then go for it,
then
right?
go for it. Right.
Be unapologetically who you are.
Sure.
For me, it tends to be a little more discreet.
Uh-huh.
But there's certainly brands out there that are, yeah, they're riding in on a war eagle. Like that's
Yeah.
their, yeah, that's who they are. So
Yeah. So,
yeah, I would say don't hide it though.
yeah. Yeah. I would say, kind of to that point, like, put it out there, let it be known that, hey, this is a veteran owned company. I know from my own experience, there's a farmer's market in our town, and I went on there one day looking for one particular thing, and I ended up walking by a booth that had things that veteran owned, whatever. And I ended up just stopping by there and buying something from them in addition to whatever else I was looking for, just because
Affordable.
it was
Yep.
a veteran owned business. And I, got to know the person a little bit, talk to them, who, figure out what it is that they're all about, and kind of their background, and seemed like a good person. So I was like, what the hell, I'll support them, and bought something from them. But without that sign, I probably would have walked right past it. Just
I think the other advantage too, especially if you're, kind of living in the digital space like Cloud Splitter does, is other veteran businesses will reach out to you to partner with you,
yeah,
to mentor, to share wins and losses. They may not even be in the same industry, or there's even opportunities to donate or give charitably back to veteran organizations from your business. So I think, yeah, I think there's a benefit to putting that label out there. It's just going to expand the business.
yeah, that's awesome. I think really great advice, for folks who are starting a business. Veterans, obviously, if you're not a veteran, don't put that on your product, but don't do that. But if you are, it's, I mean, you've earned that title, so why not use it? And it's not like you're taking advantage of anything. That's a title you've earned, and so go for it. For folks who are listening, coffee drinkers out there, I know veterans have a lot of coffee drinkers, and it's kind of a big deal amongst veterans. Anyone who wants to try out Cloud
Mouthful.
Splitter coffee.
Yeah.
It's like my mouth is getting split over here the way I'm talking. No, the Cloud Splitter coffee. Anyone who wants to check that out, where can they go to find out more about it and place an order and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so you can go to the website, cloudsplittercoffee.com. And we have on there, you'll see all of our different roasts. We have 5 different roasts: light, medium, dark, espresso, and decaf. You also see all of our merchandise on there. And then you can also, there's a feature to locate where's that trailer at here locally. If you're in Western Maryland, Pennsylvania, the kind of the four-state area here, West Virginia, Virginia, where we're located at, and maybe we can connect. So also you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and you can follow me on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. And I'll have links to all of that in the show notes as well. So for folks who are wanting to check it out, go straight to the show notes. You can click right through on there, and it'll get you to where you need to go. But Billy, really, thank you so much for coming on the show and kind of sharing a little bit about your journey, your entrepreneurial journey, and how your military background has benefited you going forward. Between the resilience and the grit and those types of things that come out of military service, that's just kind of a byproduct. I think a lot of us walk away with, whether we realize it or not. But also, just how you were able to get the business up and running, while working a regular corporate job, and get that up and running, and then kind of leaning into it and making that your full-time thing. I think that's a great way to go. And for folks who are out there wanting to do something like that, I think that's certainly something you can consider, and definitely give that a shot. Once when you've found that thing that you think you're passionate about, can make some money on, definitely do it that way. I think that's a good way to go.
Take the leap.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So yeah, thanks so much for coming on and sharing, everything that you do. And, we'll definitely get that link out there and hopefully get some folks buying some coffee.
All right. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
See you.